2003, when Teach the Sky went live, I began promoting webcomics were the dominant art form in America. For like 5 years, they were the next hot big thing, and they've kind of fallen to the wayside. I know Johnny Wonder is still doing really good stuff, although I feel like it's gotten a little aimless, but it's still beautiful by all metrics. And there's a bunch of others, but in the early 2000s, you had Sluggy Freelance, you had Apple Geeks, things like that, really great stuff. I wanted to compete with that. And at the same time, I was also becoming enamored with television as a medium. I was watching West Wing and Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Firefly, things like that. And so I conceived of stories that were going to be a little bit more like television as opposed to anime and video games, which were my novels at the time. I wanted people to read my novels and think anime, think video games. I described them as anime-style novels. That's really what I wanted people to see when they read Crossworld, when they read Guy. But with my serials, I wanted them to think more television shows. And so you had my original story, which was called Teach the Sky. In subsequent years, I would rename Red Moon Rising. About 3 different factions trying to make the world a better place and how they would come into friction with each other. That the idea that you can have the exact same goal as someone else and be totally opposed to them. And that's where Teach the Sky came from. That's where the name Teach the Sky came from. It was that story. And that spun off into subsequent series. I had Teach the Sky was a very big success. I had a great readership. I was tremendously proud of that readership. And I followed it with a story called Neo-Romance, which to this day is one of my favorite stories. And it killed my readership. It just died. Almost overnight. But it was an exploration of what romance is like in, at the time, modern storytelling. Hello. And it was the story of a music composer who composes a soundtrack for a video game, which at the time was amazing. Only Nobuo Uematsu had done that kind of thing. And so for an American composer to make a soundtrack for a video game, that was revolutionary. And it's about his relationship with 4 different people and how he grows through their relationships. I followed that with a series called Dead Man, which is a horror story. And it was at about that point that things were really hitting their stride. And story after story after story, I kept progressing and moving on and developing this incredibly rich and wonderful world. And I reached a series called Self-Alignment, which was about a character who was transforming himself. It opened with him at a nightclub and him hitting on a woman and her getting pulled away by an abusive boyfriend and him starting to fight with her boyfriend and just completely getting his ass beat. And somehow finding something transformative in that experience. And he goes through this journey of self-discovery and reinvents himself entirely by figuring out who he really is. Even we have stories of self-discovery, but they're always rooted in childhood. They're always rooted in teen years or early 20s. The idea that you have a person who has a work history, who's, he's ambiguously in his like late 20s, early 30s, but I never set the date. But the idea that you can be post-college and still discovering yourself, that's something fiction a lot of the time doesn't really deal with, or you get it in the form of Life of Schmitty, where it's this hapless loser whose, life is completely meaningless. And like, no, your life can still be meaningful, and yet you still go through this transformation. Unfortunately, that story got cut off halfway through because that was 2009, and I found a torrent and was like, no, I don't want to do this anymore. But I keep wanting to come back to those serials. If you've been to my website, teachthesky.com, there have been several false starts. I restarted Red Moon Rising at one point and just couldn't get the traction I needed. Before that, I started a series called New Phase, which was to connect back and be kind of the reboot of all of this stuff. I had planned, and I busted my ass for 2020, this MAGFest, to be revealing the re-release of the serials, and it still didn't happen. I cannot express how much work went into those serials and how hard I worked on them and how tremendously proud I am of them. But I don't want to put out something that's half-assed. I don't want to phone them in. And so because of that, that's why they haven't returned to the website. But I am optimistic, perhaps delusionally so, that they will actually return, because there's a lot left there that I really want to tell those stories. And I think the world's kind of getting to a point where that kind of medium would be appropriate again. I have tremendous reverence for fan fiction writers. Archive of Our Own, which I've mentioned facetiously a few times, is the avant-garde of literature. If you want to read good stuff, you can definitely get good stuff on Amazon and in the bookstores, and if you can find a bookstore, and whatnot. But art produced by the big 5 publishing houses, the big 6 publishing houses, is art by committee. It is art that is determined to sell. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. Art by committee is not somehow less art. It is not somehow less valid. It is not somehow less good. Art by committee is still solid, good, excellent art, or at least can be, and is more often than a lot of people think. Just because, you know, multiple editors and committees worked with it doesn't make it less. That said, it is art that almost by definition is meant to appeal to as many people as possible. It is art that is meant to turn a profit. I ain't gonna fault nobody for that. I would sell out in a heartbeat if somebody would pay me. But if you want art that is gonna be risky, art that is not meant to appeal to everyone, but meant to appeal to a very specific group, you have to look at independent authors. And right now, that's Archive of Our Own. Right now, that's the fan fiction community. The supernatural stuff is the story fandom that I really follow, because they created the Alpha Omega story arcs. And if you're not familiar with that, don't Google it. You're not going to be prepared for it. But it's amazing how these fans have created this whole genre that is worthy of deep psychological and sociological evaluations. They have pushed literature in new directions that no previous medium could ever touch. And that's the avant-garde of literature. It's not for everyone. Some of it's not for anyone. But it is amazing how they have transformed the medium. And I aspire to what some of these people have done. And I want to bring that into my storytelling. Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering, also this is Phil, but can you repeat the question?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you interact with your fandom at all? Or like the people who write your fan fiction, like you were mentioning, that does happen. Like do you interact with them, or are you sort of like lurking around and things?
So I have not found any fan fiction of my stories in a very long time. What I found was years and years ago for the Crossworld saga, which has been out of print for some time. Legally, I cannot interact with my fans. There have been several very ugly, very unsettling stories of fans suing authors, claiming the authors stole their ideas from their own fan fiction. Sometimes that's fans seeing dollar signs and thinking they can go for that. Sometimes it is authors taking liberties with stories fans have created. I subscribe to T. Morris's kind of philosophy, which is I want to encourage it. I desperately want it to be there, but as much as I want to, and I can't tell you how much I want to, I will never read fan fiction for my stories because I do not want to risk that kind of thing. I know some of it will be awful. I know some of it will be amazing. I know some of it will be better than anything that I could ever read. And I desperately want to read it, but I never will. I will look for it. I will find the title, but because I don't want any fan to fear that I will appropriate something they have created. I will tell family members and whatnot, hey, read that story and tell me if it was good, but that's it. But yeah, you had asked if I ever interact with my readers or with my fan fiction authors, and the answer is I haven't seen any fan fiction in a long time. I haven't gone looking too recently, but I do look periodically. I saw some fan art quite some time ago, but I haven't seen fan-created content of any of my stories in a very long time. I think part of that is the lack of the visual medium. I think a lot of fan creators, whether they're fan artists, fan fiction writers, anything like that, they respond to a visual component for inspiration. And until a story crosses from literature into TV, or crosses from literature into television or comics or something like that, they very often don't break into that modality. Literature, at least right now, suffers from a crippling inferiority complex that you're not a successful author until you have a movie deal or you have a TV deal. Most authors view it that way as well. And that is unfortunate, but it's also very understandable. So, yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I saw another question. Yeah. We're being very informal right now. And I've already run through the entire timeline. There's only like 11 books to work with. So, I really wanted Crossworld to be turned into an anime series, and in the back of my mind, I still kind of hope for that. But I do feel that probably the thing that's going to succeed first in that regard is going to be Rest for the Wicked, Rest of the Time, and the related short stories. There's just too much fun to be had there. You've got a cyberpunk street merc who doesn't take himself too terribly seriously. I've seen a lot of people who have responded to Rest in ways that I've not seen any other story responded to. And it's a lot of fun, and I really love writing him. And the amusing thing is, Rest was a lark. I never planned that story out. I literally wrote Rest for the Wicked, stream of consciousness over a long holiday. It was like a 3-day weekend, and I wanted a palate cleanser. I just wanted something fun. And I just wrote it from start to finish without really giving any thought. I didn't know how it was going to end when I started it. And I ended up with it, thought, hey, this was a lot of fun, and just saved it. Didn't think about it until 2012 when Manny Camacho, who runs Caffeine Ink, was like, hey, you got any stories? And I was like, I got this one lying around. And we went from there. It's a wonderful franchise that I can do a lot with, and it's a wonderful franchise I'm hoping fans will do a lot with. I'm hoping people will see that there's a rich, terrific, slightly ridiculous world in there that they can play with. You can do tragic stories like Rest and the Gang Problem. You can do just stupid stories like Rest and the Polar Bear, where Rest has to liberate a polar bear from an animal exhibit in a mall. And it's about as silly as you could possibly imagine, and it's great. But yeah, cyberpunk is a genre you don't see a lot of because it is based on satirizing the real world, and it's hard to satirize our world at this point without turning it into true parody or just becoming really, really tragic and uncomfortable. So, yeah. I do have to say, give me 1 second here, because of people that walked in. One of the organizations that most inspired me early on was actually a mainstay of MAGFest, and that was the X-Strike Studios. No, seriously, if you're not familiar with X-Strike Studios, their work was made for a budget of what you can find in couch cushions, but it was made with a level of passion and commitment to a medium and still a level of expertise. And their work, I think, really stands. And if you haven't seen any of their movies, it's worth checking out. But to this day, I think fan-created content that begins to bridge from fandom into original creation is amazing stuff. X-Strike Studios, I sung the praises of Archive of Our Own and will continue to do so. Fan films, again, the stuff that starts to blur those lines between fandom and new original content. Some of it's terrible. Probably most of it's terrible, but some of it is truly masterful that rivals or even exceeds the best writers, the best filmmakers on the planet. Yes, ma'am, you had a question.
I'm just like spurring conversation here.
Bless you. Thank you. You're incredibly kind and generous for that. I appreciate it. I must apologize for the crowd, the noise that they are creating. The fans are very rowdy and ill-behaved, but...
I do want to, like, so you said you just published a new book.
Yes, ma'am.
And, like, I'm not really familiar with your work.
Good for you. You're living a decent life.
Yeah. Can you tell us, like, a little bit about it?
Rest of the Time, which is my 11th novel, is about a moron who has to stop a rogue AI from killing its creator, which is cyberpunk plot number 4. So the world of Rest is ambiguously in the future in a cyberpunk setting of Sacramento, California. And it's very important to note, I have never been to Sacramento. Say again?
I live in California.
Okay, excellent. Have you ever been to Sacramento? Okay. You are welcome to inform me of how miserably wrong I have gotten that town. But I have made no illusions of the fact that I will just make stuff up. Like there's an important plot point in Rest of the Time involving one of 7 great spanning bridges through the town. Yeah, no, I know there's nothing like that. Exactly. Yeah. Of course.
There was an earthquake.
Right. Yes, exactly. So, and I have absolutely no problem with any of that. People who do exhaustive research in fiction are amazing to me, but they are not me. Realism for me is an invited guest at a party, and if it's not going to get along with the story, I will ask it to leave. But so Rest is hired by his friend to help save his creator, because I stole the plot from a old anime nobody has heard of called Black Magic M66, which was a precursor to a series called Appleseed. And in it, a rogue AI is trying to kill its creator it's trying to kill its creator's daughter, because the creator programmed the AI so that it would go after his daughter as a failsafe to make sure they didn't get free, and they still did, of course. So, I reference Masamune Shiro in the story where they actually talk about why would you possibly program an AI to kill you? Well, it's a tradition dating back to this anime series. And so this poor hapless idiot has to protect this programmer while this AI is hunting him down. It was an experience to try to explore Sacramento a little bit more. In the first Rest story, Rest for the Wicked, our characters travel to an abandoned military base called the ISIS Complex, which is a name that aged very well. Yeah, I know, exactly. At some point, my publisher asked, because we're getting ready to re-release Rest for the Wicked, and he was like, do you want to change the name? I was like, no, the damage is done. We just need to own it that it was, I named it after the mythological god or goddess, not anything else. Nevertheless, it did not age well. But they go to this abandoned military research facility because there's evil there, and where there's evil, there's valuable. So they go in, everything you could possibly imagine goes wrong. They escape with their lives, spoiler alert, and they escape with their lives and come back to Sacramento. Well, so naturally, they do what anyone would do. 2 of them try to sell scripts to turn it into a movie. So Rest of the Time opens with Rest waiting to watch the premiere of the movie based about the event he organized from the previous book. Because he got left out of it. He signed away his rights because he wasn't paying attention to what he was signing. So the entire movie, there's this constant theme of he can't call in reinforcements because all of the mercenaries through the same staffing agency he works with asked for the night off so they can watch the movie. So lean into the absurdity a little bit of it. Rest for the Wicked 3, which is completed, but we haven't started the editing process of it, will be out whenever the editing process is done. I don't know. That will actually involve Rest going to a small California town. So we will take him out of the cyberpunk environment and stick him in a town. And I did exhaustive research trying to find a California town called Amboy. It is a tiny town, it is a real town, and I then immediately made up everything about it and pretended it's entirely different from what it actually is. But Rest will be traveling to this small-ass little town. And I hope the residents of Amboy, all 4 of them, don't get mad about that. But I figured if anybody's going to have like a tourist trap, it's going to be these people. So maybe there'll be like a Rest for the Wicked statue in Amboy, California next year. We'll see. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, another question.
Go for it, please. Anybody else can chime in. We're very informal at this point. Please, go for it.
So you, going back to like your realism thing,
Mm-hmm.
and how realism is sort of in a way, I guess, where you don't like always do like exhaustive research, which I get. But you also talked about how you think that diversity is really important in books, and you want to include these sort of underrepresented groups as characters in novels. Do you do any sort of research, and you stopped talking about making a straight white male and everything, do you do any research as to like the experiences of those groups that you then include in your novels? Or like how do you incorporate that in a way that doesn't feel false to you?
Excellent. So the question was, how do I, without doing exhaustive research because I'm lazy and a hack, how do I write stories that involve characters or perspectives for which I am not familiar with? Like, I am a male, how do I write a protagonist that's a woman? I'm straight, how do I write somebody who is homosexual? And the answer, in my mind, comes twofold. One is a complete willingness to make a mistake. I am prepared for somebody who is gay to come to me and say, you wrote this character terribly. I'll own it. You're totally right, I did. I'm thoroughly prepared for somebody to read Guy and say, your concept of gay people is atrocious. All I could say is that it comes from a place of love and respect. And secondly, and more importantly, and this goes to the background in role-playing games and storytelling. Kevin Siembita, I think his name is, who's the main writer and brainchild behind most of the Palladium role-playing games. In one of the Palladium world books, he talked about you don't write what you know, you write what you feel. And because you can't write what you know if you don't know a subject matter. I can't write what it's like to be black, but I can write what it's like to feel marginalized. And I can lean into that feeling. One of my books is called Proton. It's about a cosplayer who gets superpowers and discovers all the ways that that's amazing and fun, and it's a very short list. And I'm friends with cosplayers, and I tried to study like their social media feeds and figure out which were all toxic, down to the one. But I tried to see where they were, but I didn't lean into try to understand their struggles as cosplayers. I studied my struggles as a writer and projected them onto the cosplayer. The human condition is ultimately universal. We all go through the same stuff, we just go through it differently. In writing, people talk about there's nothing new under the sun, there's only so many plots, and that is completely true, but that doesn't mean an individual perspective cannot be totally revolutionary. There's nothing any person has experienced that another person has not experienced in some fashion and in some way. And all you have to do is explore it, magnify it, and you can find the truth of what they're experiencing. And you have to lean into that sympathy or empathy, any number of things, but you can find a way to bridge that gap in experiences. And then you just follow it and then make it up the rest of the way. And if you do a bad job, you own up to it, but at least it came from a place that yours experienced. I had a woman tell me that she was amazed at how poorly I wrote a woman in Proton. And she was like, women are not that wishy-washy. Women are not that heartbroken and depressed and all of these other things and fragile. And I was like, and I didn't tell her this, but it was like, everything you're describing had nothing to do with her being a woman. It had to do with me being a writer. Everything she was pointing at was coming from me and my experiences as a writer and as dealing with depression and whatnot. And I found it very telling what she was latching onto and feeling attacked by actually had nothing to do with what she thought I was attacking. And part of that's going to be the interpretation of the artist and the author and the audience. So, for those of you who are just coming in, my name is Robert V. Aldrich. I am a novelist and writer, and I am here talking about 20 years in the writing and creating business, and all the fun, the few successes, and many failures and adventures therein. Due to the crowd, we have the luxury of being very informal, so if you have any questions or anything like that, please throw in. Do you have a question, or are you just giving me the thumbs up?
I'm running the next panel.
Oh, okay, there you are. All right. So I think it's safe to say you do not need to worry about us running over time. So, excellent. Well done there. Yes, sir. The handsome man in the back.
You can have it. Much appreciated. When I met you, you were Robert V. Aldrich, the guy who wrote anime novels.
Yes, sir.
And now you just write novels.
Yes, sir.
Was there, and I didn't really think about it until now, I'm just like, you don't really do that anymore. Was that like just kind of where the writing took you, or were you like, I'm done with this? Was it like a conscious decision, or just kind of like where?
Both. Yeah. It was a result of the marketing, and when I started doing that in like 2002, for those of you who can't hear on the YouTubes, he asked, I used to call myself an anime writer and say I wrote anime literature, and I don't do that anymore. Part of that was because anime was a very unique and defined thing back then. Nowadays, anime has diffused, and it has procreated, and it is promulgated, and you can find anime-influenced medium, and anime itself has absorbed a lot of influences that it didn't 20 years ago. And by and large, that's a good thing. I cannot I disparage fans who say, things were so much better back then. No, they weren't. You just have rose-tinted glasses. And the evolution of art is always a wonderful thing. Nevertheless, I, as a writer, also began, because as soon as I published my first book, I immediately thought of how I needed to be better and what I needed to do better. And that involved taking in more literature and taking in more studies of literature and reading and whatnot. I took in so many other influences and mediums, it felt disingenuous to kind of call things anime, especially because I was no longer actively trying to simulate that storytelling style. If I go back and rewrite Crossworld and re-release it, I will probably go back to that moniker for that specific story. But for Rest for the Wicked is not an anime story. Rikaiju in many ways is more video game than Crossworld was, and Crossworld's how I came to be at MAGFest originally. But it would depend on the individual story and the individual tale that I was going for, and the feel I wanted people to have and see when they read it. I love anime. I, to this day, still dream in anime. But at a certain point, I had to decide, was I going to be constrained by that medium, or was I going to move on to something more holistic? And I decided to go in that direction. Okay, we got a few more minutes. Do we have any additional questions? Yes, sir.
So you sung the praises of some fan fiction earlier, and obviously those are not derivative, but they're derived from an original work. And some of those stories have taken a life of their own. Is there anything that you could say, like, if you wanted to encourage an author to break out with their own story, do you think there's any kind of tipping point, or do you really think that the fan fiction itself is the work?
Fan fiction has evolved and blossomed like many forms of fan entertainment, to where the clear distinction between this is fan fiction and this is original work can often become very blurred. Famously, Star Wars was created because George Lucas could not get the rights to Flash Gordon. And so you will see fans creating content. We talked about the Alpha Omega stories with the Supernatural fandom, that kind of thing. Fan fiction, I'm going to regret saying this, fan fiction is like porn. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And at a certain point, you will have a story that is almost wholly original. And that's great. That is the purpose of fan fiction. It's not just to show your love for a specific fandom, as great as that is. It is also to help you grow and blossom. You are contributing to that story, you are contributing to that fandom, but you are also contributing to the beauty of the world by creating more art. Fan fiction, like fan art and everything else, is just art with training wheels. And you eventually kick them off and you've created something totally new. Even if you're still using those characters, you know, hook a brother up, give me some credit, but if I read a story that's 90% original characters but rest is in there, I would consider that an original work, partially because rest is really derivative. Yes, sir, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, like you sort of, for yourself, have defined success as like having that fan engagement. Is there anything you do yourself to kind of bring that about, or do you just like put the work out there, say like fans have at it? Yes,
any attempt to create it will not go well. Any attempt to like I've reached out to some some cosplayers and whatnot to cosplay as characters because I know those characters would have very complex and very expensive costumes. I contacted one cosplayer to do Proton from the Proton story because she has a very defined helmet, she has a very defined suit, and that's not going to be the first the first cosplay somebody decides to go for. In that instance, I thought it was a little bit different, but I was going to pay for that. I was going to use that for promotional materials and whatnot, and her schedule didn't line up, and I frankly just didn't have the money. It was more than my budget could allow. But in general, it's not something I feel comfortable encouraging.
Not even directly encouraging, I just mean like a mailing list, a Twitter following.
Oh, I have a Twitter following. Yeah, no, I'm absolutely shameless in self-promotion. My Twitter exists just to remind people I write stories. And, you know, to retweet, you know, Bob Chipman and that kind of thing. But no, I don't want... It's you create the art, the fans get from it what they will, and if they enjoy it enough to feel inspired to create something, then I've done my job. Then I have achieved the absolute pinnacle of success. If I had to choose between like a movie franchise like the MCU or cosplayers doing my characters, I would choose cosplayers without batting an eyelash. Oh my God, would I love that money? But I want fans to like my work. I want them to be inspired by it. But if I could have both, that'd be really wicked. Like, man, would I like both. But, yeah. Yeah. I remember the first fan cosplayer I saw was a fan of mine dressed up as Jessica Cameron from Crossworld. And I genuinely cried. Like, it amazed me. It was wonderful. I've seen fan art for, you know, Trebor and Vincent from Crossworld. I've seen a pack of guys did did fan art for the Knights from Red Moon Rising, Teach the Sky, and it looked really, really cool. And then my computer hard drive crashed, and I lost it, which breaks my heart to this day. Because it was, Teach the Sky was, the Knights were, like only one of the Knights was white. The rest of them were like black. One dude was Indian American and whatnot. I actually, in 2017, when we had the march in Charlottesville, I decided I needed to make my stance on that very clear by writing a Red Moon Rising short story of the Knights versus the KKK. And that's a really fun story, and I really enjoyed that. But and so these guys drew real like street urban style art with these characters, and oh, I loved it. It was great. And then I had to lose it. I don't remember who they were. I don't think I ever got contact information. But yeah, if the fans feel inspired to create work based off of what you've done, you've succeeded. You've won. Yeah. All right, I got time for maybe 2 more questions. Anything else? All right, fantastic. Y'all, yes?
This could explode into a larger discussion.
Bless you for that.
Very quickly. self-publishing or small publisher, big publisher? What do you prefer, having done almost all of them?
I do not know what the big publishers have to offer anymore. Everything I have seen from authors who have signed with the big publishing houses, they have been thrown to the wolves. They have gotten no financial support. They have gotten no advertising support. They have gotten no social media support. The big names do. James Patterson gets that kind of stuff and whatnot, but the people who sign with it, they get listed on Amazon. And so I don't see what they have to offer. I would love for a big publishing house to throw me a deal and let's see what, we see what we can make happen. But unless it comes with a dollar sign or an advertising budget or something like that, I really don't know what they have to offer anymore. I was talking earlier with some people. Pip Ballantyne, who is one of the co-authors of the Ministry of Extraordinary Events, Ministry of Unusual Occurrences. It's a steampunk series. They're amazing. I strongly recommend them. Her and T. Morris, they're the two who write it. Shared an article about write like you've got a knife to your back, because nobody knows how to succeed anymore. There is no clear-cut method to success. So don't worry about it. Create good art and maybe you'll succeed. But yeah, it's kind of depressing.
That's pretty much it.
It's kind of depressing, but it's also liberating. So I want to thank all of y'all for coming. I have been a writer for more than 20 years now. I've been coming to MAGFest every year it's been here, and this has been a huge celebration for me to be here. I cannot thank you enough for coming to the panel, all 50,000 of you. Bless you for that. Pretty sure this video is not going to actually make it onto YouTube, but maybe we'll get lucky. Exactly. But I really cannot thank you enough. I thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of MAGFest.